The two of them made a schedule. Hugo also gave Kiara an old flip phone. This way they could communicate with each other. At times he knew he would have practice, he would text her and let her know. And when he was free, he would go to the building and study with her. His teammates had no idea why he would go. They had asked, but he had not given them a solid answer. He wanted to keep this relationship with her as secret as possible. Also, because his teammates wouldn't believe him if he told them he was friends with a ghost. Hanging out with Kiara has been so much fun. She was shy at the beginning, especially after her turning a bit crazy, but Hugo assured her that he understood her reaction. He had promised her and broken her trust, even though it was his coach who forced him, so he had to try and regain it. Luckily, she was back to trusting him very quickly, although that might not have been such a good trait. They had been talking and doing homework for a couple months now. Hugo's grades were starting to get better, and his parents were very happy. So were the teachers. His teammates were also happy that he seemed to be picking himself up. They asked if he was taking any lessons, but Hugo just replied that he had a very good teacher. It was one of those days where he just came to have a good time with Kiara. They had done his homework earlier that week, and he had no more to do. They started to explore the building. "Can you leave this building?" Hugo asked as they walked through the halls at a slow pace. Kiara shook her head. "It's difficult." She was walking beside him, trying to get the hang of it again, instead of just flying next to him all the time. "I can go to the other school building, but I can't go outside. It takes away too much energy. I think it's because I died here," she explained. Hugo hummed. He had learned not to ask too many questions about how she died, or the things that happened before that. Kiara would always get defensive, and her entire eyes would turn black. They turned around a corner and were shocked to see there was only one door. Hugo walked over to it, curiously eyeing the padlock on the door. It was rusty, and he would probably be able to pull it off. "Want to see what's in there?" he asked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Kiara couldn't help but be curious as well, and nodded. She started flying and moved towards the door. A sudden boink startled Hugo as Kiara fell back with a yelp. I can't go through." Her voice was a little shaky. Hugo put a hand on her cold shoulder and turned her to him. "We don't have to go if you think it's dangerous," he assured her. Kiara shook her head. "No," her voice was clear. "This just makes me more curious." They gave each other a firm nod, and Hugo reached out to the padlock. He gripped it and pulled it down. The lock broke off and he dropped it to the floor. He grabbed the door handle and opened it. The door made a hard squeak as it was opened. It seemed like it hadn't been opened for years. The room was covered in dust. The tables and chairs were overturned, and the bookshelves were empty or completely overthrown with books. It looks like this was supposed to be a library. Kiara suddenly took his hand, and he flinched slightly at the cold contact. When he turned to look at her, there was fear all over her face, and she was shaking. Her eyes were focused on a part on the floor. He matched her gaze and walked over to a giant bookcase with a weird dark brown color staining the floor. Kiara didn't move from her spot, so Hugo let her hand go. He kneeled down and touched the color with his fingertips. It was dried up, so he didn't get it on his hands. He was too afraid to smell it, so he stood back up and looked at the way the dark brown color was spread across the floor. It surrounded a bookcase. Hugo gulped and turned to look at Kiara. She was still shaking. He wanted to take her out of here, but he was just so curious as to what happened and what was behind the bookcase. He took in a deep breath and walked over to the side of the case. He used all of his strength to push it aside. While the structure was heavy, the shelves were empty, so it was easier than Hugo had thought. As he was at the half point, he stopped and looked at what was behind the bookcase. His eyes widened in horror, and he gave a scream. His body scrambled back and he landed on the floor inside the dark brown stuff on his butt. The scream made Kiara focus on Hugo and she flew over to him. However, she was also horrified at what was behind the case. Behind the bookcase was a giant hole. It might have been part of the construction, or it was made when this building was used in the 80s. What shocked them was laying in the hole. A skeleton. There was a skeleton inside the hole. Some skin was still hanging from the bones, as well as some threads around the chest area. It was sitting upright, slumped against a pole inside the hole. Next to the body was a leather backpack, still fully intact. On the backpack was an engraving that made both of the teens' blood run cold. Kiara A. Jenkins. Hugo wanted to throw up. He had never seen a dead body before, but it just had to be the body of the girl he had been so fond of these past few months. He would not be able to unsee that ever again. He mechanically turned his head towards Kiara, but the words died from his mouth. Kiara was furious. She remembered everything now, how she was killed and who did it. Her eyes were back to black. Her mouth was stretched into that awful and creepy black smile. Her hair floated up and got sharper, her face pale as snow. The hand she had on Hugo's shoulder now held a tight grip, her nails slightly scratching his skin. Kiara. Her name left his mouth, but she suddenly disappeared in a flash. Hugo was left alone, staring at the empty space where Kiara was. His heart was in his throat, and his brain refused to work properly. He gulped, his throat suddenly very dry. He shakily stood up and moved closer to the dead body. He took a deep breath and cringed as he reached and grabbed the leather backpack. The smell was filling his nose and it was disgusting. He quickly grabbed the bag and took a couple steps back, his hand over his mouth and nose. He made it out the room and closed the door tight. He would have to go back later, preferably with the police. He jogged back to the classroom they always used, but she wasn't there. He put the bag down next to him and continued to search the entire building, even the newer school building. But Kiara was not there. He cursed and went back to grab his stuff. He opened the leather backpack and searched for something in there, but most of the books and paper were almost gone. He found a sticker of a park that looked familiar to him. Hugo knew where the park was, since it was still there, even after all these years. He hauled his own bag on his back and grabbed Kiara's old bag. Hugo sprinted out of the school, getting a few weird looks from his teammates. He ignored everything and ran all the way to Hallway Park. Once he got there, it was dark, and he panted as he stopped. He looked around and saw Kiara sitting at the top of a building, looking over the park. Hugo ran towards the building and scanned the outside. Luckily, there were stairs, so he could easily make it to the roof. As he got on the roof, Kiara's back was towards him. He could see her shaken, and he heard her sobbing. It broke his heart to see her like this. He cautiously made his way over, and when she didn't do anything, he sat next to her on the edge. He had dropped both backpacks behind him and leaned on his arms as he put his hands on the ground. They both sat there in silence, and when Hugo looked at Kiera, he could see that she was back to normal, still sobbing, but her eyes were back to that soft blue-green. "I'm sorry," Hugo eventually said. Kiera gasped a little, but didn't say anything. "I had no idea that was there. I wish I could just..." He trailed off, not really sure what he would say. "I remember." Kiera's voice was soft and scratchy, full of emotion. Hugo looked at her in surprise. Her eyes were focused on her hands that were laying in her lap. "I remember how 3 people, a girl and 2 boys, were messing with me for being smart. They wanted me to do their homework, but I refused. One of the guys pulled out a knife to threaten me. I stood my ground. They didn't like that. Suddenly the knife was at my throat and he slit it." Her sobs came back. She buried her face in her hands. "I don't know what happened after, but..." Hugo placed a hand on her shoulder and she flinched. Kiera looked at him and he smiled. "Come." Hugo opened his arms and Kiera hesitated for only a moment before she shot towards him and buried her face in his chest. Hugo put his arms around her shoulders and softly caressed her hair. "I'm going to call the police," he whispered. "I will show them that I stumbled upon your body. They will hopefully be able to provide some more information. Maybe even contact your parents." Kiera full-on wailed at the mention of her parents and nodded in his chest. "I tried to search for them, but I couldn't find them," she hiccuped. Hugo hummed and gave her a small kiss on her head. "If you tell me their names, then I can tell the police. They will be punished, Kiera. I will make sure." Hugo's voice turned lower and more dangerous. Kiera looked up from his chest and put her hands on his cheeks. Her eyes were red and puffy. Tears were flowing down her cheek and she looked tired. Hugo just saw her blue-green eyes sparkling. With what, he wasn't sure, but he couldn't take it anymore. He slowly leaned in, and when Kiera's eyes went to his lips, he made his move. He softly pressed his lips on hers and Kiera sighed. It was wet and cold, but he didn't expect any different. Hugo had been daydreaming about kissing his ghost friend. He wondered if it would be even possible, but he was always able to touch her, so it shouldn't pose a problem. It was more than all right. Even though they were cold, her lips were soft. He did no more than just connect their lips, since he didn't want to scare Kiera, but he wanted more. Oh, he wanted more. And Kiera noticed. She tilted her head, and this time Hugo gasped. She took this moment to softly bite his underlip, and he pressed his tongue between her lips. Kiera opened her mouth more and played with his tongue with her own. It was still soft and slow, but it was perfect for them. Her saliva tasted like lemon, and he was pleasantly surprised by how well she was kissing him. Hugo wanted her to take the lead, since he did not know how far she would want to go. Eventually, they had to stop. Hugo's jaw was hurting, and he was getting lightheaded. He softly pushed her away, just enough to stop their lip locking. His cheeks were flushed, but Kiera noticed that she liked that. Hugo put his forehead on hers and kept her in his arms for who knows how long.